Good evening, class, and welcome to the 7th class in this course, U.S. Presidents, Nixon to Obama. I contend that the greatest threat to a president's legacy is not losing the re-election for the second term, it's actually an impeachment. Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution defines an impeachment as, quote, the removal of a president for treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. Or as Gerald Ford claimed in 1970, when he was still a member of the House of Representatives prior to his becoming the vice president, Ford had actually said an impeachment is, quote, whatever the House of Representatives says it is at any given time. Today we're going to look at the presidency of Ronald Wilson Reagan, and what I contend was the biggest challenge to Reagan's actual presidency. Reagan was elected in 1980, and he served 2 terms from 1981 until 1989. Much of Reagan's presidency can be seen through 2 lenses. One is Reagan's desire to shrink the size of government under what we call the new federalism. We'll look at that next week when we look at Reagan domestically. The other way that we look at Reagan is how he dealt with the threat of communism as what he saw as a threat to democracy. Most people my age remember Reagan for the speech he gave in Berlin when he was directly addressing Gorbachev, the head of the Soviet Union, where he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." One could argue Reagan's greatest challenge when it came to battling communism was not actually the Soviets. It was actually members of his Congress. Today we're going to examine something called the Iran-Contra affair. This was a political scandal that erupted during Reagan's second term. We'll discuss whether Reagan broke the law or was he subject to a political witch hunt by members of the Democratic Party. Remember, Reagan is a Republican. As we discussed during the first week of this course, when we talked about President Nixon, Nixon was investigated by Congress for the Watergate break-in. And Nixon felt this was a partisan attack by members of the Democratic Party. So much so that Nixon fired the first investigator because, quote, that investigator was a part of those damn Kennedys. But members of Congress, even members of Nixon's own party, cooperated with the investigation when evidence came to light that President Nixon had obstructed the investigation when he ordered the CIA to tell the FBI to stop investigating the break-in. We know about this because of recordings in Nixon's office. From our readings last week, we also looked at the legacy of that break-in and that investigation and how that affected the presidencies of Gerald Ford and Carter, who both followed. Most notably, in the post-Nixon era, the idea of appointing a special prosecutor, a man whose sole job is to investigate the president. So what was the Iran-Contra affair? So the Reagan administration was caught selling weapons to Iran, who were our enemy, and using the proceeds of those sales to help Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Before I tell you more about that, the question you're going to need to answer is, did the president violate the law, or was he just the target of a political witch hunt? Nicaragua had a communist government with anti-communist rebels trying to overthrow that government, and those rebels were called the Contras. Reagan wanted to arm the Contras so they could overthrow the communists, hence the phrase, the Iran-Contra affair. In 1982, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, and that forbid the sale of weapons to the Contras in Nicaragua. The amendment was passed by a democratically controlled Congress, and the whole purpose was to prevent Reagan from intervening in those affairs. At the same time, 7 Americans were being held hostage in Lebanon by Hezbollah. Hezbollah was heavily influenced by the Iranians, and so Reagan believed if he armed the Iranians would help secure the release of those 7 American hostages. Reagan knew those hostages by names. He was personally involved, very much connected in trying to get these Americans home. Now let's remember something. The sale of weapons to Contras was forbidden. The sale of weapons to Iran was not. It was run by the National Security Council. Congress had no knowledge of what the National Security Council was doing. The National Security Council was originally formed by Truman in 1947 to help him with foreign affairs. It's made up of members of the presidential staff. The president is the head of the council. He has the final word. But in Reagan's case, A lot of the decisions made on the National Security Council were not cleared by Reagan. They were actually made behind his back, made in what they felt was he would have wanted it that way. Below Reagan in the National Security Council was Admiral Poindexter, and below him was Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Please see the diagram on my PowerPoint for the entire organizational hierarchy. When the story broke of the sale of arms for hostages, Reagan went on TV and he claimed that he had given weapons to the Iranians, but he had, quote, not traded weapons for hostages. Congress launched an investigation. Congress claimed that the National Security Council had violated the Boland Amendment. The White House said the National Security Council does not fall under the purview of the amendment, and therefore a battle for jurisdiction erupted between the Congress and the executive branch. Now let's note the similarities between this scandal and the Watergate scandal. In both cases, we have a White House cover-up. In both cases, we have White House staff below the president running programs that the president's unaware of.
Thank you.
With Nixon, CREEP was an organization below the president to re-elect him. That's what it stands for. And below that was the Plumbers, which was an organization of Nixon cronies to gather information, plug leaks. In Reagan's case, it was a little bit more legit. He had members of the National Security Council below him. Poindexter, and below Poindexter was North. They were selling weapons. They were not breaking in. They were not doing anything legal. They were just not telling Congress. In both cases, we have a Republican president who turned to his lawyers for guidance. In Nixon's case, his counsel, John Dean, actually spilled the beans and testified for immunity. We also have a battle for control of the government between the legislative branch and the executive branch, and we can consult our Constitution later and talk about the breakdown of powers between Article 1 and Article 2. In the end, it was reported that Reagan did actually, quote, trade weapons for hostages, but Reagan was unaware that the funds were being diverted by Ollie North to fund the Contras. There's the illegal part. So North was found guilty. Reagan avoided criminal prosecution by being, quote, out of the loop. Being out of the loop is the same line George Herbert Walker Bush, Reagan's vice president, would use a few years later when Bush runs for the presidency. In an ironic twist, Reagan actually did lie to the American people about, quote, arms for hostages. But when he made the statement, it was a public address, not a testimony under oath. So what Reagan said did not perjure him. He only embarrassed himself by lying. Quote, a few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it's not. So what lessons are learned? Nixon was brought down when tape recordings of his White House conversations came to light. Poindexter and North both learned from that and destroyed many volumes of documents that might have actually incriminated Ronald Reagan. Number two, in the end, Reagan had to go on TV and take responsibility, even though he was, quote, out of the loop, as we've said. Reagan said, first, let me tell you, I take full responsibility for my own actions and for those of my administration. As angry as I may be about the activities undertaken without my knowledge, I am still accountable for these activities. This is called the buck stops here. It goes all the way back to Harry Truman, that no matter what happens in your administration, in the end, if you are the president, it's on you. This is important to us because when we look at the presidency of Bush 43, George W. Bush, who will instigate the second Gulf War, we're going to look at the chain of command between him, his Secretary of Defense, his National Security Advisor, and his Secretary of State, and you're going to see the buck stops here will come back to haunt him with another disconnect. Number three, when we get to Bill Clinton, you're going to see Bill Clinton will also be under congressional investigation, and Bill Clinton's wife will claim her husband is the target of a vast right-wing conspiracy. She will claim that the investigation by Congress into Bill Clinton's actions was nothing more than payback by Republicans for the way the Democrats had gone after Reagan. At that point, we're going to do a comparison, and you're going to tell us, was it a conspiracy, or was this just checks and balances? As always, if you have any questions, I'm available by email, and you can reach me by making personal appointments. Thank you, and have a good evening.